Yeah, that's supposed to be the beast that comes out of the sea in Revelation chapter 13. I could not get that AI generator to give me a beast rising out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns. This is it. This is the closest I could come. And this looks something like more like Nightmare at Country Bear Jamboree than it does Revelation 13. But, not all AIs are created equal, okay? If you create an AI and it's retarded, you send it into a career of generating images or as a customer service associate. The really smart ones, they go to BlackRock and DARPA and figure out ways to kill us, okay? The AI I got, unbelievable. But the point is, guess what the church is doing? They are guaranteeing you being left behind. Because what is coming is a test. The final test on earth. You want to get off earth without tasting death? There's a test. The test is simple. The test is easy. Listen to him. It is very similar to the test that was given in the first century to those people who would see Jerusalem surrounded by armies and the abomination of desolation. They both happened in the first century. The fact that your pastor doesn't talk about it doesn't change history. It happened. And the Lord told those people, when you see these things happen, get out. Don't go down into your house and get a cloak or anything like that. Get out. And pray ahead of time. They were supposed to pray ahead of time that this trip they would be on would not be in winter or on a Sabbath, because that would make things difficult. If any of those people, and we know for a fact, according to early Christian historian Eusebius, that the first century Christians heeded these teachings and this warning from Christ and got out. But if any of them had said, "Oh, I don't have a spirit of fear. No, I'm saved. I'm not worried about it. I'm staying here. Jerusalem's my home," they would have had the worst 3.5 years of their life. And if they could have lived through that, when the Romans broke through the wall, they would either have been killed or led away captive as a slave for the rest of their lives, separated from their families. It's a test. Our test is similar. You can read about it in Luke 17, starting in verse 22. When you read that, you'll see this is nothing like what they're telling me about the rapture day. How come what Jesus is saying here looks so completely different? Yeah, that's a good question. And today I'm going to show you and hopefully expose to you the extreme limits, no, the wrong word, the extreme dimensions that they will go to fool you. Now, people tell me in the comment section, "Stan, I think you're a little hard on them." They don't mean to be deceiving us, but they are. And they're making sure you have an appointment with the beast, because you're going to fail that test if you don't start listening to the Lord, and they're keeping you from him with their nonsense. I no longer care about those guys at the front of the church. I just don't. I don't. I'll pray for them and all of that, but I really don't. They're the ones that inflicted this on us. I'm more concerned, I should say it that way, I'm more concerned with the people in the pews who are trusting those people to tell them the truth. Now, in this video, I was going to go through a John MacArthur video about why he believes the day of the Lord and the rapture are separate events. And I was going to do that similar to what I did in the previous video with Pastor Greg Laurie. But as I was listening to the nonsense he was teaching for 58 minutes, and that was just part one of MacArthur's series on why the day of the Lord and the rapture are two different events, it hit me that there's something far more important here than just the fact that John MacArthur is teaching complete and utter ignorance to his congregation and people worldwide who listen to his sermons. something more important here. There's an opportunity here, and it's the day of the Lord. And we're going to get into that because it's an important distinction. Is the day of the Lord connected to the rapture? John MacArthur says, no, it's not. There's a reason for all of this. We'll get into that. But folks, at some point, common sense should play a role here a little bit. It's not the defining factor of figuring out prophecy, but it should play a role. If someone says something that makes no common sense whatsoever, you should probably investigate it a little further before you sign on. In that regard, let me ask you a simple question. The disciples who became apostles, those, the 12, well, the 11, excluding Judas now, when do they get raptured and resurrected? Simple. The answer is when we do. They're part of this period of time. They were the founding members of the church. As a matter of fact, we know that most of them, if not all of them, were early Christian martyrs. Disciples, apostles, don't get a special resurrection. They go with the church. They're part of us in the times of the Gentiles. Paul understood that. He said, we, including himself, who are alive will not precede those who are dead. In one place where he's talking about the rapture, he put himself in that rapture with the rest of the Thessalonians. They're going to go when we go, okay? If you doubt that, really? You need to make a YouTube video on it then if you doubt that. So let me ask you this. Since MacArthur is going to say that the teaching Jesus gave at the Olivet Discourse goes at the very end, here on this timeline. That's where the Olivet Discourse coming. That's where what he describes in Luke 17 as well is placed by MacArthur and all pastors, with the exception of just a few. All of them, from post-trib to pre-trib, all will stick with the Lord said at the Olivet Discourse about his coming and in Luke 17 at the very end. The rapture, however, will be much earlier. And on that point, I agree the rapture happens before the beast rises out of the sea. Yes, I agree with that. I do not agree with putting the Olivet Discourses coming at the end, but be that as it may, this is then what John MacArthur and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of pastors also teach. Now, the disciples were there. I don't know how many were there. There's a little disagreement about that on the Mount of Olives that day. I don't know how many were there during his teaching of Luke 17, but there were some there. Can you explain to me why Jesus, if MacArthur's correct, is telling the disciples to stay ready for this event at the very end, when they would be going in this event at the rapture, way before it? Why would he be telling them, and he did, to stay ready for this event? He said, you must be ready for this event. He said, pray and watch always for strength on that day. Why? They weren't going to be here for it. They're going in the rapture. Why didn't he tell them about the rapture? So we're to believe, if we're going to believe MacArthur, that the Lord never told the disciples, soon to be apostles, about the day that he's coming back for them. He told them that he would come back for them, but he never described that day. He described a day that they'll never see. They'll never be a part of, because they're going to be resurrected and given their eternal bodies at the rapture. Does that make sense to you? Of course it doesn't. If that makes sense to you, then simply put, you're crazy. Because it doesn't make sense to sane people. This is why their story falls apart time and time again, and you're going to see MacArthur's point about the day of the Lord fall apart and shatter into pieces, even though he's smarter than me, he's far more knowledgeable than me, but I'm listening to the Lord, and I have the truth of the matter. So let's get started. Ground zero in this discussion about the day of the Lord. Well, let me start it this way. Why is the day of the Lord so important in this discussion about the rapture? Because the Lord includes the day of the Lord when he discusses his coming in the Olivet Discourse. He uses day of the Lord verbiage right here about the sun and the moon. That's from Joel. And MacArthur acknowledges this. He says, yes, the Lord is talking about a day of the Lord. He's associating his coming that he's about to describe with the day of the Lord. Okay? So to get you to stop listening to the Lord at the Olivet Discourse, they want to differentiate the rapture from the day of the Lord. If they can get you to believe that, they'll then go to you. See, the Lord's talking about the day of the Lord. That's not what the rapture is. He's not talking about the rapture. Yeah, I know he's going to send his angels out to gather the elect. Just ignore that. That's not the rapture. That's a day of the Lord event. The rapture's not the day of the Lord. And now you no longer listen to what the Lord said. Plus, it's exactly what the sixth seal also does. Begins with day of the Lord verbiage. They don't want the rapture at the sixth seal. They don't want the rapture at the coming of the Olivet Discourse. But what's really unique about this discussion, take, for instance, the war in heaven. When the Lord talks about war in heaven, he does two things right up front that are brilliant. First of all, he tells you the kind of day it's going to be by mentioning it's a day of the Lord. Secondly, he says war in heaven will have just taken place when I show up, to let us know what general area this is going to be. It's not going to be at the end. But if I show you that this is war in heaven, and you say, what John MacArthur says, he says that's a meteor shower and some cosmic displays of some sort, then there's no discussion. I can go, well, you're wrong. And then you'd go, well, you're wrong. And then I'd go, well, you're wrong. So it's a conversation ender. But since we both agree that Jesus is talking about the day of the Lord at the start here, that begins what he's about to describe as his coming, now we've got something. Now we're on some sort of common ground. I agree. MacArthur agrees. Every pastor would agree. Yes, the Lord is talking about a day of the Lord event here. Now let's move to, well, is there somewhere where we can prove that the day of the Lord is either not connected to the rapture or is connected to the rapture? And the answer is yes. Ground zero is 1 Thessalonians, and MacArthur knows that as well. At the end of chapter 4, 1 Thessalonians, Paul talks about the rapture. Let's let John MacArthur read it because he knows this is ground zero for this debate.
For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words.
And by the way, all Christians should be taking this quiz, because here's the quiz question. Paul just talked about the rapture. We all heard it. In chapter 5, the very next thing, he's going to talk about the day of the Lord. Is Paul changing, as MacArthur would claim, he's moving from the rapture and the joy of it to the judgment, though, that's associated with the day of the Lord. He's moving from one prophetic event to a different prophetic event. I'm saying Paul did not change topics. He continues to talk about the rapture. Everyone, every Christian should make a decision here about this. Unfortunately, for my side, a little bit, there's a chapter break here. Paul's talking about the rapture, chapter break, and he moves to day of the Lord. Okay? So in MacArthur's presentation, this chapter break is very, very beneficial. It's easier to sell. There's a chapter break there. He was talking about the rapture, chapter break, now he's moving on to a different topic. That makes sense to a lot of people. What doesn't make sense to me is chapter breaks were given by a Catholic bishop in like the 12th century. For 1,200 years, we didn't have chapter breaks. This is a lousy chapter break. He should have kept all of Paul's prophecy in this letter to the Thessalonians together. It should have all, no matter what side you're on here, it's still about prophecy. All prophecy in that letter should have been in one chapter. But anyway, it doesn't really matter. You're going to see the truth regardless of the chapter break. I just want to point that out. The first words of chapter 5 are these: now concerning, or in some cases it'll say now as to, now concerning. I'm going to go with now concerning. John MacArthur will say those are transition words from Paul. And I'm going to say he's absolutely right. Okay? So this adds to now, initially, to what John MacArthur is saying. He was talking about the rapture, chapter break, now concerning transition words. And he's transitioning to the day of the Lord. Gosh, it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? If I'm sitting there in a pew and I didn't know the truth about what's going on here, I'd go, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. No, it does not make any sense, as a matter of fact. I agree, Paul is transitioning here, but not to another topic. What he's transitioning to is from what I know about the rapture to what I don't know about the rapture. And he's got a lot to say about that. Now, look carefully at what he says about the rapture at the end of chapter 4. If you want, stop this video and go read it yourself, because there's something he left out. What does Paul leave out in his description of the rapture? When? When? He doesn't mention when. He doesn't even give a hint. And MacArthur would agree with that. He says so in his sermon that I listened to. He doesn't mention when. It's not there. Now look at the first sentence following the description of the rapture. He says, and to comfort one another with these words that he's just spoken about the rapture, and we should. Rapture is a comforting thing for us. It's fantastic. It's unbelievable. We look forward to it. The next sentence in that letter is this: now concerning the times and the seasons. Brothers, there's when. He is now transitioning to when. And he's about to tell us we can't know when is. So we have to stay ready. Now before we move on, just so you know, times and seasons. Let's look at both of those Greek words. They're about time. First one, chronos, time. Here's the Greek word for seasons, also about time. He's moving to the timing of what he just said. You can see that in the sentence. He's not starting a new topic here. He's continuing with what he just said. He says, here's what's going to happen in the rapture. Now, concerning the timing of the rapture, you know very well, brothers, and here's what he says next. Now, concerning the times and seasons, brothers, you have no reason for me to write to you. You already know. The day of the Lord comes as a thief. He is associating the rapture of the church with the day of the Lord, just like Jesus did at the Olivet Discourse. His coming for his elect begins with a day of the Lord. Paul is associating that here as well. Not changing topics. And I can prove that to you if some of you are still on the fence. Well, I don't know. Let me think about it. Okay, yeah, you should think about it. He goes on to say the world is not going to be ready for it. It comes with sudden destruction because it's a day of the Lord. Just like the Lord talks about at the Olivet Discourse, just like he talks about in Luke 17. It comes with sudden destruction, and the world is not going to have a clue that it was about to come. None. It just happens. And it's big, and it's bad, and it's devastating. But Paul says, but you're not in darkness like them. You're in light. We can, even though we don't know when it's going to take place, we can always be ready so that that day does not overtake us. And he tells them how to do it. And then he tells them to comfort one another with, whether we're alive or asleep, dead or alive, we're all going to be with the Lord. He's still talking about the rapture. And once again, he says, comfort one another with these words. Now, think about it. Add the common sense to it again. If Paul changed topics to the day of the Lord, so he went from talking about the rapture to the day of the Lord, he tells the Thessalonians, comfort one another about the rapture, because we're going in it. They were actually listening and paying attention. But then he switches topics and says to stay ready for the day of the Lord. Why? They don't need to. They're not going to see it. No, he's telling them to stay ready for the rapture, which is at the day of the Lord. Do you see the links they'll go to deceive us? And this isn't the first time Paul has linked the rapture with the day of the Lord. In 2 Thessalonians, he says this, now concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, he wants to talk about the rapture, he says, right up front. And then he goes on to say, look, I know somebody told you, wrote to you, and got you to believe to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. They think they missed the rapture. He is saying, I want to talk about our gathering together. Someone lied to you and said the day of the Lord has come. It's already happening or happened. And they think, well, where's the rapture? And then he goes on to explain the mistake, that it's not. The day of the Lord is way too early for it. There's reasons for it. We're not going to go into those reasons here in this one, but this again, he's linking the coming of the Lord, the rapture, with the day of the Lord. The Thessalonians knew that from the first letter. If you can't see that, try and see it over here in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 5. There's a guy, and Paul is shocked that he's having some sort of illicit affair with his father's wife. And Paul tells them, throw this guy out. Now listen to what he says. You are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved. Now, Paul is either saying he hasn't lost his salvation, but he has to be thrown out of the church, or he's saying, throw him out, and then when he comes to his senses, he can still be saved. And Paul says if he does that, he will be saved on the day of salvation, which of course is the rapture. And this is what Paul is saying, throw him out so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. That's the day of salvation. That guy is going, and apparently in 2 Corinthians, there's an indication that this man came to his senses and repented, and he's fine. So he will be saved just as the rest of us, just when the rest of us are, at the day of the Lord. That's what's coming. Paul links it together, the rapture with the day of the Lord. The Lord, because the Lord links it with his coming. A day of the Lord is coming. That's why when you read Luke 17, starting in verse 22, it looks so odd. What day is this that he's talking about? He's giving instructions, and it looks foreign to Christians. What is that day? Because that can't be the rapture, because that's not how they describe the rapture, because they've removed the rapture from the day of the Lord, and they're willing to do that. It's a day when people are fainting, the Lord says, killing over. In the sixth seal, we see people of the highest order, the alpha males and the alpha females, all the way down to the servants and the lower class of people, all running and hiding from what is happening. So it's natural that the Lord is saying you have to be ready for that day. That's why we are to pray for strength on that day, because it's going to be a day unlike anything we have ever seen. He's trying to get that point across to us, and he does so beautifully, but we've moved it away. We let them steal that away from us, and now they replaced it with some silly day at the beach day. Don't worry about a thing. It'll be over just like that. It's not what he's saying. It's our final test. He expects us to pass it. On that day, it's going to be revealed if we were listening to him or not. If you're listening to him, there's nothing whatsoever to fear. Just contemplate the kind of day, understand that you need to be ready to go on that day, not to be like Lot's wife, as he said. Don't pull a Lot's wife on that day. And ahead of time, pray about it so that when it happens, even though it's a strange day, you're ready for it. This is exactly what Paul told the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Stay ready for it. It's a big day. Nothing is going to be the same after that day. When that day comes, everything in heaven changes. Satan and his angels are being thrown out. Heaven is being purged of that demonic influence and presence, and they're being cast to earth. And that's going to change everything down here. Earth is warned once Satan is cast. Oh, he's mad and he's got a short time and he's angry. Woe to you, earth. And this great reset has taken place. And that's when the beast comes rising out of the sea. You do not want to be here when the beast comes forth. And the Lord is saying, there's no reason for you to be here. Listen to his instructions about that day. Everything will be fine when you listen to him and prepare as he says to prepare. This is what they're stealing from us. Darn right I'm mad. Don't tell me to play nice because I'm not about to. I'm calling them out. People's lives are at stake. Their futures are at stake. The best day of their life needs to be the best day of their life and not the worst day. God bless you.